what responsibility does the church have in dealing with the donations they receive? To talk a little bit about my origin story, I used to work at a church and had more and more kind of conflicting feelings about it. And this was actually the final straw for me, where I had finally decided I just don't feel comfortable participating in this right now. I was a graphic designer at the church, and we had a financial series coming up, which I had done graphics for financial series before. But now that I was questioning all these things, I just couldn't stomach the idea of the type of language churches tend to use when they say your donations are giving money directly to God. Churches will use the line, God doesn't need your money. And I always wish churches would say, God doesn't need your money, but we do. Right? Like I thought that would be a more honest way of communicating their need for donations, because I'm not against nonprofit companies or anyone really asking for money. I think, I've donated to NPR, Wikipedia, all kinds of charities through the years, right? Like that's not a bad thing in itself. But I just think the language the churches use when they say your tithes go directly to God is very problematic for me. And I wonder if you feel the same way, or if you think I'm being overly critical with that.
I do feel the same way. And this has been a tension point even when I was in full-time ministry, because I didn't necessarily see it the way most pastors see it or most Christians see it. For example, I would say, let's begin with the idea of tithing, which is the way most Christians talk about, giving to a church. Here's a fun fact, Jeff. Nowhere in the New Testament do we have any examples of the church tithing. We have no examples of Christians tithing in the Bible. Okay. You're going, whoa, wait, what? Yeah, there's none, like literally none. The examples that we use is one conversation Jesus had with a Pharisee. So it's a Jewish religious leader about the covenant they were in. And it's even in the past tense of like, here's what you should have done in this, covenant. Not talking to a Christian, not talking to someone who has decided to give their life to Jesus post, crucifixion and resurrection. None of that applies. Then we often go to like Malachi, which is Old Testament. Test me in this, says the Lord. And pastors love that verse. And all these things I would say are old covenant. These are all old covenant models. And you go, okay, well, so what happens after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection? You have wild generosity in the early church. And it's full in the book of Acts and 1 Corinthians and all these places. Like huge generosity, beautiful generosity. But there's no percentage ever given on it. And, the only time it really gets weird is when people are lying about how generous they are, and then they end up dropping dead. And, Ananias and Sapphira, so it's a kind of bizarre story. You have no example of Christians being instructed to tithe to their church or them ever doing so. I would point this out to other pastors, and it would never go anywhere. And I remember just thinking, like, I'm not sure what to do with this. And so it got to this place where when I was an executive pastor, who, I was also filling in the pulpit, I just had to say, hey, I can't teach tithing in good conscience. So if that is required in that message, I can't be the one to teach that message. And then when I became a lead pastor, I had to tell the elder board when they hired me, like, FYI, I'm not going to teach tithing. I'll teach generosity, which I did, but I just wouldn't teach tithing. Now, that's the first part. So let's just acknowledge that. And some of our Christian listeners are maybe feeling a little heartburn right now. Like, whoa, what do we do with that? So that's a whole other topic.
Maybe thinking like, wait, so I didn't have to be giving 10% of my income this whole time?
I don't think you do. And honestly, if it's, giving from the heart and it's, needs-based, it will often be far more than 10%. I think just the 10% thing is such an Old Testament way of thinking, and it totally misses the spirit, what I see in the New Testament. So let's start there, okay? So some of you need to just pause the podcast, go for a walk, pull your car over, get some fresh air, go get a drink. I don't know what you're doing. If you're working out, put the weights down, Just give yourself a second, okay? Now,
It
I think
really
we also
depends
have
on
to help.
which end of the spectrum people are landing, right? Whether this is good news or bad news you're giving them, Jeremy.
That's true with a lot of stuff that we give on this podcast. It could be good news or bad news depending on where you're at.
Yeah.
Now, to your other part of the question, is it as simple as giving to the church equals giving to God? I'm going to say no. It's not that simple. And I say that as an insider. I don't say that, throwing rocks at other churches or throwing rocks at pastors. I say that as someone who deeply loves the local church. But I do not think I think the language, I would agree with you. I think the language we use is problematic. That we say, hey, if you give X amount of dollars to this nonprofit entity, local church, you are giving that money to God. Now, part of the challenge is I've had to manage church budgets of millions of dollars. I have seen where all this money goes. I've had to oftentimes be the one deciding where the money goes or influencing where the money goes. Here's the reality. Most churches, the majority of their salary or the majority of their budget goes to pay their pastoral salaries or just their staff salaries. Okay. So and that's not true for every church, but most churches, more than 50% is not uncommon that you would have more than 50% of your annual budget is going to pay staff. So just acknowledge that and be aware of that, right? Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Just be mindful of that's where most of the money is going. The second next biggest chunk is usually the buildings and the mortgages and the stuff that goes into the buildings. If your church has a production budget and does moving lights and video cameras and all that, their production budget is probably way bigger than you have any idea. Like oftentimes millions and millions of dollars. So I would say that's the second area. Then the third area is usually what we think of when we think of giving to the church, which is the ministry dollars or the money that's given away or, that kind of stuff. That, in my experience, at least, is a smaller makeup. Now, I don't say that with an indictment on the church of there's this great scandal. I don't. I would just suggest for our pastors listening to this that you be more upfront of where the money's going. And so here's a way I think a church could say it. And I, as a person that has my own issues with some of this language, would not have issues with this. So, for example, you could say something like this: your money allows us to do ministry in this way. And you could reference the weekend service. You could reference an event you do. You can reference whatever. Like, hey, the way we're doing ministry, your money, your giving allows us to do this. If you find value in this, please give generously to allow us to keep doing it. And again, I think a lot of people would be like, sweet, I do love it. I love the weekend service. I love this event. I love this whatever, and would gladly keep giving to it. And what I think it would do is it would give people who go, I don't want to give to moving lights. I don't want to give to bigger worship centers, right? It would give them an honest out without shame or guilt to say, that's actually not something I want to put my money in. And I would just be really candid at this point in my life. That's not something I want to give a lot of my money to anymore. I have given much of my income to that over my career, but these days, that's not where I find my passion to invest, our generosity. And so if a church is more direct of this is what your money goes to, I think that's much more honest. And I'd be curious, Jeff, if you heard a church doing that, and let's say that, all right, I'm going to put you on the spot. You're contracted to do the financial graphics for a series, but rather than the language that was used that you referenced, the language is used this way. Hey, here's how we're doing ministry. If you believe in it, your dollars will allow us to keep doing it. Would you have less heartburn with that kind of communication, or do you think it would still just the act of soliciting funds, would it still rub you wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would be comfortable with that. I'm not sure if I would work at a church right now. At the time when I was communicating with the leadership, that kind of was what I put forward. I was contracting for them at the time, and I said, I kind of gave them a couple options. Was like, one was just, is there a way that I could just not do the graphics for this series? Could you get someone else to do it, and I can continue to work with you in the future? Or I could just kind of cut ties with you now, or could you could you guarantee transparency? This was a church where I'd heard them use the language I already described before, and I guess I honestly just didn't feel like there was any chance at all that I was going to speak into what they were going to say from stage. And that wasn't really my place to either. I wasn't a teaching pastor or anything there. I'm all for transparency. There probably are churches out there that are better at this than others. There probably are churches where they open it up and allow people to see specifically where the money is going, and even to designate where you want it to go to. I think the church I worked at even had an option where you could say, like, I want this money specifically to go to overseas missions instead of to production budget or whatever. I understand that we live in a society, Jeremy, and we need money to make things happen. So I don't think it's wrong for churches to ask for money in general. Like I said, it's kind of this specific language of equating giving to the church equals giving to God was what really rubbed me the wrong way.
And I think that's what's most intriguing about this conversation is, someone who's maybe getting defensive by this conversation, or, is in the church might be thinking, hey, this is just not fair, But I think what we're both suggesting is not that you can't ask for money or even encourage it. We're just saying that there should be a level of transparency that is often missing in the conversation. And I think it ultimately goes back to the idea of spiritual authority, that a more old school way of thinking is the church is the authority on where your dollars go. So shut up and get your checkbook out. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have any right to say, I don't want this to go to production. You should just give and entrust the church to that. I think that's the history of how we got here. The challenge with that, I would say, is there's just been way too much abuse, in the church, that I would be very uncomfortable with any church environment saying, hey, you just need to trust us blindly. We're not going to tell you where it's going. We're not going to give you say in it. How we decide to spend it is all supreme. I would feel very uncomfortable with that. And I don't think it needs to be like that. And so I think this might be a really good thing that the church is having to work through and having to figure this out. But I just, I know in some of my conversations with pastors, I've had this conversation where I've said, hey, I think you should say it like this. And I've asked them, would you be uncomfortable saying that from the stage? And, recently I had someone say, no, I would be totally comfortable describing giving like that. And so it was cool. It's like a win. Like, oh, like you feel like you can still ask for what you need and you can do it with integrity. And I feel like you're far more, genuine and authentic in how you're asking for it. And so then I don't have, any negative reaction. So I really think there's an opportunity here that's probably very misunderstood in church circles by a lot of people.
Like, if you say it's going to this charity to pour back into the community, something like that, pointing out like, well, what percentage is actually going to those charitable portions of the budget? I guess I should lay my cards on the table here too, to say that even though I don't work for a church currently, many years of my life, that was my career, was being a graphic designer at a church. And I always felt pretty conflicted about it. The thought of, like, in my mind, at least, I criticize churches for having a production budget, right? And I am directly benefiting from that, right? Most churches do not have the budget to have a full-time graphic designer on staff. And I really enjoyed my job, and I thought, this is a great job. I really enjoy being a graphic designer, but I feel a little bit icky about the whole financial scenario in that sense.
I think the win is just, release some of the weird language that's worked for a long time, maybe, and just call people to your method of ministry. And again, the people who love it will give to it. Like, even if it's, we're kind of picking on production budgets, but if they love that experience and they think, hey, this is the environment, for me to bring a friend to, and because you have moving lights and these giant screens, I feel more comfortable, then great. They're going to be the ones very comfortable giving money to that. And so I think that's fine, but just, be more transparent rather than, some archaic, we are the ultimate authority of where your money goes. I think we have to acknowledge in the current culture with these nonprofits and millions of dollars on the line, it's more complicated than, we often want to use it. And so, moral of the story, giving to the church isn't the same as giving to God.
I always think about that with the lights and fog aspect of mega churches. It seems so shallow and lame to me, if I'm being honest. But I don't know. I must confess, I feel conflicted about it, because if I go to a concert, right? Like, let's say I go see Radiohead in concert and they have way more lights and fog than any mega church, I would not be critical of them. I would say, man, that was an amazing experience. I loved it. But for some reason, when I go to a mega church and I see the lights and fog, I just roll my eyes at it and think this is an abomination. So,
but I think the difference is when you buy a ticket to Radiohead, you buy a ticket knowing what you're about to experience, and you're paying for that. Like, hey, I want to go experience the lights and the sound and all of that, and that's and you're paying for it, and you're paying for it, right?
Right.
But when you go to church, I think the reality is not everyone wants to pay for moving lights at a church, and not everyone would agree that that's how a church should be doing it, and that's where I think the miss is. So again, let people contribute financially to the things that they go, yeah, I really like this ministry. I think it's very valuable, and they'll give to it. And stop guilting them or trying to shame them if they look at your model and go, that's not the way I want to, invest in the church. I want to do it differently. And I think there's got to be room for that, and also just a sense of there is no percentage. If you go off the New Testament, there's no, you could give 5% joyfully, and that might be what God is calling you to give. You could also give 50%, and that might be what God's calling you to give, and anything in between. And you see all those kind of examples in the New Testament. So I think this is one, I think it will change in the church, because it's going to have to change, because I think more and more people are going to have a negative reaction to this conversation. And so I hope any pastors listening to this, or, anyone who's on a staff or has influence, can lean in and hopefully do it in a healthier way.
Yeah. Transparency. Preach it, Jeremy.